David, speaking to us on Passover.
Thank you. Good morning. How is everybody? Great. So this is one of those, as a minister, a schizophrenic Sunday where, because in the Christian tradition, of course, it's Palm Sunday, and we could be talking about Palm Sunday and all the events that are coming up into Holy Week. And it's also, of course, coming up this Friday evening begins Passover, the great Jewish festival. And so it's like, and they're both rich in metaphor and rich in symbolism. And so, which one do I want to take? So next year we'll do Palm Sunday. This year we're going to do Passover. And because I get to. Because I want to. Last year, my very first talk that I ever gave was Easter Sunday when I arrived here. So it's been almost a year that I've been here, and so I didn't get a chance to do the Sunday before Easter because I was already lined out with somebody else. So we're going to do Passover, and Passover commemorates the liberation of the Israelites from bondage in Egypt. That's why I love this reading by Ernest, which is actually on the very, very, very first page of the entire Science of Mind book. Is that whole bondage is not God ordained? Isn't that a great line? Yeah. How many of us have ever felt in bondage at some point in our lives, right? And no, I'm not talking about that kind of bondage. I'm talking about, stuck, This is a family service. So we're going to look at the whole Exodus story. And the Exodus story for some people is a cause of concern because we get into the cruelty of God, and there's a bunch of stuff laced through that, and we're going to take a look at that. But it's also a fabulous, fabulous story for the metaphysical view and what's taking a look at what's really being communicated, because it's not what it looks like. So the first thing to understand about this whole story is it never happened. It's not factually accurate. The Egyptian culture of the time was one of the most sophisticated in the world. It was one of the most advanced civilizations on the earth at the time. And they had people recording history from way before this time to way after this time. And you would think that if a whole bunch of plagues showed up, topped off at the end by having all the firstborns killed, a whole bunch of people left, and the Pharaoh's army drowned in the Red Sea, you would think it would make the evening news, right? But it doesn't. Nowhere in the Egyptian history is any of this stuff ever written. It never happened. So that brings up this question, so what is this story really about? So first of all, it's a foundational story. Genesis is the same way. Genesis is really dealing with how did the world begin? And the very early portions of the world, kind of before the Jewish people, the Israelites were established, what happened. And so there's three different creation stories. There's, the story of the Noah and the flood, because there was a flood somewhere in that area, and how did people survive it? And then there's the volcano and earthquake that went off and destroyed a couple of cities, and how did that happen, and all this explanation. And so it's also these stories that are wonderful teaching stories, but not factual. Okay, are we good with that? Most of us know that Genesis is not a factual account of, God did not create the world actually in 6 days, because days hadn't even been invented yet, and what's God's day? And all that stuff. So the same thing with this story. So we move into this story. The story of Exodus then begins to be, it starts a little bit into Genesis with Abraham and that lineage, but it starts to be, how did the Israelites, how did this Jewish people get established? How did they get to this homeland? And so there's this wonderful story of moving out of it, because if you remember at the end of Genesis, Joseph has been elevated to second in command of all of Egypt. His brothers come to partake in the food that they have there because he'd saved up for the famine. And the whole family eventually ends up migrating into Egypt and lives there happily ever after, supposedly. And these are the 12 tribes, the sons of Jacob, who are the starts of the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is the origin of the Jewish people. So how do you get them from Egypt to the Promised Land, to where they're living now? And so that's what this story is about. That's what this adventure is about. But the adventure is also a powerful, like all of the stories in the early part of the Bible, a powerful teaching story, a coded story that if you understand and can unpack it and unwrap it, helps us to understand how to be more effective in our lives and more powerful in our lives. So we're going to play with that today, okay? Great. So this story is a foundational story. This story is the foundation of the Israelites. And the Israelites represent our consciousness. But we're going to walk through the story first. So I mentioned at the end of Genesis, life is good. They're living happily ever after. They're honored in Egypt, and everything is good. Joseph has just died, but everything is still good. The first chapter of Genesis, verse 8, starts with, if we had a little, Kathy Zott and I have worked on this, we're going to have a little bit of musical accompaniment for the story in the second service. But we have this ominous music representing, because it starts off in the first chapter with a little different tone. It says, "Now there rose up a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph." Okay, can you hear that? Dun, 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 dun. Okay. This is a fear-based king. He's worried because the Israelites are becoming strong, and they're becoming multiplying, and they're participating in it, but they're not one of us. And so he's afraid that if they ever go to war, the Israelites will sabotage them from behind while they're in their home. Fear-based, right? Now, we know that we've gotten rid of that. No societies today ever operate like that, but... And he says, and I love this phrase. This is complete political doublespeak. "Come, let us deal wisely with them before they multiply." Love that line. It's like it's been going on since time immemorial. So he starts off by oppressing the Israelites and making life miserable and worse and worse and worse. And finally, not even that gets him down. So finally he decides to order that all newborn boy babies must be killed. Okay? And so that's where we start off. And of course, a boy baby is born who gets named Moses. His mother builds an ark, sticks him in it, floats him down the river, lands in the reeds. The Pharaoh's daughter finds him, isn't going to kill him, and so raises him up as her own. And in an interesting twist, it's actually his own mother who raises him, who nurses him, who brings him up. There's some fun stuff in this. We're going to do a high-level view of this. There's so much symbology in this. I could probably teach a 6 or 8 week class just on this story alone for all the rich symbology in it. But we're going to take the high level of it. So Moses grows up eventually, comes across, has a burning bush experience, where he encounters the burning bush, is called by God to be his messenger and to stand up for him. And so he ends up standing up to the Pharaoh, saying, basically, let my people go. And the Pharaoh, it says, and this is how you know this is part of the story, God hardens the Pharaoh's heart. Now, why would God on one hand say to Moses, let my people go, and on the other hand say, and by the way, I'm going to harden his heart so they won't? It's like, that's the ultimate, impossible situation. So God sends 9 plagues to, they're each one increasingly worse to oppress the people, and finally gets to the 10th plague, and he says, this is the one that's going to do it. And he says, you guys be ready to go, because when this happens, you're going to have to get out of there altogether. Is the phrase in the Bible. You have to go altogether. And so the 10th plague is that God is going to kill off all the firstborns, human and animal. Okay? Human and animal. This is where you know you're dealing with a mythical story. And so this is where we get the Passover meal, because God also instructs the Hebrew people, the Israelites, how to not be in the firing line of this. With the whole, you have to do a meal, you have to sacrifice a lamb, sprinkle the blood of the lamb on the door, and all that stuff, and the angel of death will pass over your door. And so that's where we get the Passover meal and the Passover process that it comes. We're going to go from that. So finally this happens, Pharaoh kicks them out, and then of course famously changes his mind. They come to, of course, the Red Sea. Moses parts the Red Sea, and they walk through into dry land, and of course Pharaoh follows them through, and the sea collapses back on and drowns the army. Now that's the end of Passover week, that period from the Passover meal, from the angel of death, to the period where they are now through the Red Sea. That's the whole Passover week. And that Passover week has a whole readings out of the Torah, which is the Old Testament, of what we call the Old Testament in the Christian terms of the Bible, that says, that goes through each of these passages and looks at them every day. And there's wonderful, rich readings, for that. We're going to go past that a little bit and look at the rest of the story. So they get through the Red Sea. In a few weeks' time, they arrive at the Promised Land. And Moses sends some people in to scout it out. And they find that it's, well, let's see, all but two of them come back with reports that say it's filled with giants, it's got all this stuff, it's just, oh my God, you ought to see it, there's no way. We have huge armies in there and like that. Two guys come back carrying massive amounts of grapes and say, look at how good this is. Okay? One of those guys is named Joshua. He'll come into the story later on. Okay? But they see it filled with giants. They don't trust God, and God comes down and says, basically, since you don't trust me, you can't enter in. You're going to wander around for 40 years in the desert, and basically it's until this generation dies off. 40 years is a generation. Sounds pretty nasty, but there's a reason for it. We'll talk about it later. Eventually they get to the Promised Land. Moses dies because Moses doesn't lead them into the Promised Land. Joshua leads them into the Promised Land. So Joshua leads them in. He conquers Jericho with his horn, the blowing of the horns. The walls collapse. There's a wonderful symbology in that, and I have yet to crack that nut for what that symbology is. I've been researching it. I've been meditating on it for years, and it's just like there's a coded story in that process, and I haven't figured out the code yet. But anyway, we'll keep on working on it. If I'm supposed to know it, I'll know it. And then, of course, it goes on, and this is one of people's favorite parts of the Bible, is to go on and God orders them to kill every man, woman, child, and animal in the land. Genocide, right? Good God, this is a nice, kind, loving God. And so, and then they occupy the Promised Land. So that's that story. Take a breath. What is this thing really about? By the way, I should mention one of the reasons I also say that this is not a factual story is that the city of Jericho is an ancient city that's been occupied and unoccupied for thousands and thousands of years. It would have times where for hundreds of years it would be occupied and thriving, and then people would leave it, and it would have hundreds of years of time where it would basically just pretty much sit unoccupied, and then some new people would come in, occupy it, it would grow and thrive, and then that group of people left, and it would be unoccupied again for hundreds of years. In the Bible timeline works out to where when they did this magnificent thing around the walls of Jericho, it's one of the timelines where archaeologists tell us Jericho had been unoccupied for hundreds of years and would be for another couple hundred years. There wasn't anybody there to conquer. So that's why, when I say it's not an authentic or a factual story in the linear sense, that there's all this stuff that says this never happened. There would have been some record of it. Okay, so let's take a look at what it really is about. We know that it didn't happen, but what is it? What I'm going to say is this is a map to freedom. This is a map for each of us to move from bondage to freedom. And we've all agreed that at times we've been in bondage. And how do we move from bondage and a state of feeling oppressed into the state of true freedom of living in our land of milk and honey, our promised land? So let's take a look at the code. Let's take a look at what this talks about here. And again, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to go through this on a fairly high level. Again, there's even more richness down below here. But that would take more time. I would still be talking through the 10:30 service about this service. So the Israelites are our human consciousness. The Israelites are us. Okay? The Egyptians are our low thoughts. They're that outer and inner circumstance that keeps us in bondage. Okay? So for the first thing we take a look at, as we move from the end of Genesis, where everything is good, into the beginning of Exodus, where things change, have you ever had the experience in your life where something that was once good now becomes something that you feel bound by? Relationships, jobs, houses, anything, right? Okay? So one of the things that it says is everything changes. It changes. As we grow, we no longer fit in the old paradigms. See, the Israelites were growing in consciousness. They no longer fit in Egypt because they weren't supposed to be in Egypt. Where were they supposed to be? They're Israelites. They're supposed to be in the promised land. Okay? So they no longer belonged in Egypt. However, they, like all of us, have a lot of resistance to change. Anybody notice? Anybody besides me have some resistance to change? No? Okay, good. I remember the first few months I hit here and I wanted to change everything up, and I had a whole lot of people going, "Right, we always did it this way." So Pharaoh represents that within us which is unwilling to change. That within us which clings, no matter how hard, no matter how difficult it gets, plague after plague after plague. It's like, I'm not leaving this until you peel my cold, dead fingers off the throats of these people, right? And we do this. It's like, I ain't leaving this relationship, this job, this house, this whatever, this belief system, until you peel my cold, dead fingers off of it, because I want to make it work. Mary Morrissey talks about when her church collapsed, that she said she left with claw marks in the ground trying to make it work, Today she's very happy it all worked, happened that way, but life is better. And most of us have found that, haven't we? Sometimes those things we cling on to, 5 years later we look back and say, "Oh, thank God," right? So Moses is our hero self. Moses is our authentic self that's trying to move us along, trying to say, open up to the magnificence that really wants to come through. Now here's the deal about Moses. When he gets called to the burning bush, he's sitting there, the first thing he says to God is, "You don't want me. You don't want me." First of all, he's wanted for murder in the land. He's already killed a guy. Okay? And secondly, he sits there and goes, "Well, I'm not very eloquent. In fact, I stutter. You want my brother Aaron." By the way, this is another clue. If all the other baby boys have been killed, how does he have a brother? But anyways, you want my brother Aaron. Aaron's the golden boy. He's so eloquent. He's so wonderful. He's not wanted for murder. You don't want me. He's not perfect. How many of us, when we get into those situations where we know we have to move, want to get all our ducks in a row before we make a single move? Okay? We want everything to be perfect. No risks. The stars in alignment. The economy is good. Whatever else it takes. And what this is saying is, don't wait for it to be perfect. It'll never be perfect. See, Aaron, the perfect brother, doesn't work out so well down the story. We won't go into that stuff, but he doesn't work out so well down the road. But Moses, even in spite of all this stuff, finally he hears, he listens to, and he answers the call. He doesn't walk by the burning bush saying, "Oh, that's weird, I'm getting away from that." He looks at the burning bush, he sees what it is, he goes and investigates. He hears the call. We get that little nudge. Do we get curious about that, or do we say, "Shut up, I don't want to hear that"? Okay? So we don't wait for perfection, and we do listen to the call. Secondly, the killing the firstborn. Sounds awful, doesn't it? God's going to come through and kill all the firstborn children and animals. When we start to move out of where we're stuck, we have to get rid of, if the Egyptians are the symbol of our low thoughts, we have to kill off what? Our low thoughts. We have to kill off the thinking, the consciousness, and the patterns, and sometimes even the people, not killing them off, but I mean getting them out of our lives that have held us to where we're stuck in. Anybody who's gone through any kind of an addiction release program, a 12-step program, knows oftentimes you got to change your friends from your old friends. If your old friends were all alcoholics or all drug addicts, and you don't want to be anymore, you've got to kill off those friendships. Now, don't kill off the people, but the friendships, the processes, as well as the thoughts. Whatever we move through, and most of you have had the experience as you've gone on your spiritual journey, as you've gone on your spiritual life. How many of you have had to end friendships or find friendships that are no longer as deep or close or whatever as they used to be, that you've had to let them go because they no longer serve you, because they don't serve your highest good? And so the firstborn is the originating. It's that which carries the lineage. It's that which carries on the thought. See, oftentimes we get mixed up in just trying to take care of the little twigs out in the tree, when what we really need to do is get down and dig out the roots of the tree and dump it, of the tree of negativity, the tree of that which is holding us back. So this is the firstborn. This is that which continues on the legacy, which sows new seeds of the same old thoughts. We need to kill it off. We need to kill that process off, end that process, and stop it. So that's what the killing of the firstborn is about. Nobody died. I told my previous congregation, no Egyptians and no Canaanites were harmed in the making of this story. Okay? Because it never happened. But it's a powerful metaphor for you've got to be ruthless enough to say, look, if I'm going to move out of here, it's going to take some ruthless, hard things to do. Right now, Reverend Sue and I were talking about I have to change the way that I eat and exercise, or lack thereof. Not the lack of eating, the lack of exercise. The abundance of eating and the lack of exercise. And so I am ruthlessly killing off desserts. And it's a hard thing to do.
But you look good, Rev.
Thank you. And hopefully in a few months I'll look better. But we have to be ruthless. We have to say, you know what? I'm doing this. I am doing this. I'm putting my foot down, and we're going this way. No matter what. And so I kill off that which continues the old patterns that no longer work for me. Eventually, we come to the Red Sea. The Red Sea is that place where we get caught between a rock and a hard place, is another way to phrase it. Where our past is bearing down on us, where it looks like there's no passage whatsoever in front of us, and we're sitting there. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Okay? We've been stuck there. And what do? And it looks impossible. And what it is that the story out of this is, if we listen, with our authentic self, to that infinite power, a way is made. And a way is made only for us. Only we, in our high consciousness, can pass through it. The low thoughts, the Pharaoh's army, can't pass through that process. The way is made clear for us to move into a new consciousness. The old consciousness is swamped. The old consciousness no longer continues to attack us. And we're done with it. And so it's the gateway, it's the portal into the new life. However, the thing to be aware of is it's not yet the new life. It's the ending of the old life. And oftentimes that comes with great drama. I've talked before about, when I was in foundations class in Seattle and we were teaching assistants, and somebody would get up about week 2 or 3 and say, I declare that by the end of this foundations class, I have a new job. And about week 5 or 6, they come in and go, I got fired from my job, And that's what it is. That's the portal to the new life. Now, you're not in the new job yet, but the Red Sea is closed, the Pharaoh's army is dead, and you're in the in-between. Not a comfortable place to be, but you're out of the old place. Now, in the story of this, the Hebrew people, as soon as they get through the Red Sea, do what?
They go back to their old ways.
They start complaining. We were better off in Egypt. At least we had food and a place to stay, and we'd be better off dying there than dying out here in the desert. Okay? There's this part of our consciousness that sits there and says, I was better off back there. That relationship, it really wasn't so bad. I mean, I'm lonely right now. There's no relationship in my life. Maybe I should call him up again. Maybe I should take another job just like the job I used to have. Okay? Anybody? The old doesn't seem so bad. We're in that in-between stage. Now the thing is, they're fed with what they need. They have the manna from heaven coming. They're guided in the whole way. And it ain't steak and lobster, but it's enough to get by. And oftentimes when we're in that interim stage, we have all we need to get by. Oftentimes it's not a lot, but we have what we need to get by. If we're open to the universe, it will provide everything that we need. And so it's important to stay open to that which is being provided. And so they have rain and manna. They have all that they need to survive. But we have to get through that tendency of when we reach our promised land, when we reach that new phase and are not at our promised land, to not go back. To say, I'm going forward. No matter how uncomfortable, I'm going forward. Number 6 in here, they arrive at the promised land. Quickly. They arrive early. They arrive before they have the consciousness to own their good. We have to match the vibration of our promised land. We have to be the kind of people who would naturally dwell in our new promised land. And sometimes we get to a place where we get, I like to call it the universe giving us little tastes, little appetizers before the main course. And what it is to help us to up-level our consciousness a bit, but we're not fully prepared to go into that. We're not fully prepared for the main meal yet. And so this is what they've got, is this place where they arrive at it, they look at it, but all they see are the problems in the promised land, with the exception of a couple of guys. And there's always a part of our consciousness that recognizes that this is the promised land, but usually it's overpowered by the part that says, I'm scared, this looks unfamiliar. If you're used to a high drama relationship, when you suddenly meet somebody that doesn't do drama, it's scary. It's boring. Right? When you get into a job where they don't treat you like a slave and pay you, less than you're worth, it's like, what do? I don't know how to operate. How do I be in this? And so what happens is they have to wander around in the desert for that thought process, for that generation of consciousness to completely die off. As we do our journey, we have to let completely go of all of the old patterns that we had that perpetuated our bondage situation, because we can't move with bondage consciousness into the free land, the promised land. They don't operate together. And so if we live in bondage consciousness, we're going to move into the promised land and see bondage, suffering, problems, more problems, big, giant problems, and we won't see the beautiful grapes. So part of it is we have to recognize, we have to work on our consciousness. This is what we do a lot here, is we work on the consciousness to start to move into our good. Mary Morrissey, again, in Prosperity Plus, talks about we can't get there from here. We can't move into the good we want from here. We have to live there and allow ourselves, as we are now, to be pulled into the consciousness that we want to be into, the life we want to be living. We have to visually and mentally and emotionally plant ourselves in that life and start to have that be our normal experience. I am a person who has healthy relationships. I am a person who works for work that I love. I am a person who has plenty of money. I'm a person who eats healthy and exercises frequently and has a wonderful body that I love. We have to move into that consciousness and occupy that consciousness fully, and then allow the body, in space and time, to catch up with that consciousness. So this is the journey we're making. This is that journey across the desert. And so we wander until the old consciousness dies off, and we finish the dark night of the soul lessons, because this is a dark night of the soul. Along our wanderings, we get guidance. Moses goes up to the Sinai, gets guidance. We call it the 10 Commandments. Actually, the Hebrew is more like the 10 suggestions, or the 10 words, I believe is called, is what it really translates out into. But we get guidance. So instead of worshiping whatever false god comes along, which is what the people were doing, which is a dissipation of the energy. If we get caught up in everything that comes along, we're dissipating our energy until we finally get focused and say, look, we're going this way. This is the consciousness that I'm developing. This is the direction that we're going. And I'm going to stay in this consciousness, and I'm going to practice that discipline long enough for it to produce results. If you've ever started a training program as an athlete or anything like that, you know that you can't wander from this week I'm going to do this program, and next week I'm going to do this program, then a week after this I'm going to do that, and get any results. You have to take one and say, you know what, I'm going to work with this. I'm going to work with yoga. I'm going to work with Tai Chi. I'm going to work with this person's training program. I'm going to work with Pilates, whatever it is you do until I get results. I'm not going to dissipate energy. I'm not going to run around worshiping whatever false god comes along. So we get guidance. And it's important to be aware and to allow teachers to show up for us to help to guide us along the way. And it's also important to finally say, and this is the path I'm following. To move from being a seeker, which is wandering around the desert, to being a finder and saying, you know what, this is it. It may not even be perfect, but it's dang close enough, and I'm taking it. And I'm hanging on to it, and I'm following this. So eventually Moses dies. Moses is the consciousness that got us out of the land and got us through the desert. But that consciousness is not that's the seeking consciousness. That consciousness is not the consciousness that moves us into our promised land. So the Moses consciousness has to die. The Joshua consciousness, Joshua, remember, has already visited the land, has already felt at home in the land, has already seen how wonderful it is. He was one of the two guys who brought back the big piles of grapes and other things and said, yeah, man, it's fabulous. He's already in the consciousness. You know, when the two organizations, the United Centers for Spiritual Living and the International Centers for Spiritual Living, were trying to come together and we're working this out. Do you know who was the first group that really got it? It was our youth. They got together. They both had bank accounts. They said, oh, let's just combine bank accounts. The adults are sitting there going, no. Our money? Their money? Together? No. And they actually joked. They said, let's call it We CSL. Instead of I CSL, you CSL, let's call it We CSL. Got it? They had the image. They moved into the consciousness first. They were the Joshua energy. They could understand it. Okay? And so we have to have that Joshua energy that says, I know what it feels like and I'm moving into it. That's what Mary Morrissey has talked about. That's the Joshua energy when I begin to move into it and claim it as mine. Now, what's this whole genocide thing that happens, okay? Again, no Canaanites were harmed in the making of this story. But what's occupying the promised land when we move into it is our old thoughts. Everything unlike the promised land has to go in our consciousness. Everything. Every man, woman, child, and animal. Every detail. And what it is it's basically saying clean your mental house completely. There's actually a couple of little groups in there who bargain with Joshua, and he lets them live, and they come back to cause a lot of problems later on. Okay? And so there's little metaphors in that story. And the idea is that when we're moving into that consciousness, we get rid of all the old. When you're moving into a new relationship, you get rid of all the old relationship stuff. When you are moving into a new job, you get rid of all the consciousness of the old relationship and the old job. Okay? You move it out completely. Because otherwise, you're going to have this tendency to want to hang on to, but this little part over here. Okay? This little part over here. Last night, Cynthia and I got into a little something that triggered off a past relationship experience for her. You know, if it was me, it would be a past wife experience, or with her, it was a past husband experience. But anyways, it triggered off something for her, and it was a little piece of baggage that we both found out hadn't been cleaned out. And so we got the opportunity to clean it out. Okay? It was one of those things that was still occupying the promised land. So the thing is, we have to clear out the promised land, get it all out and all away. Okay? So that's what that genocide story is about. Again, it takes a certain amount of ruthlessness to get your good, doesn't it? It takes an internal ruthlessness. I will no longer stand for the old, sucky, stinking thinking consciousness that I've had to live in me anywhere and anymore. Are we good with that? Okay. It takes that ruthlessness, it takes that energy, it takes that focus. So the promised land is a soul experience. The promised land isn't about the outer circumstances. The promised land is when our soul knows that it is occupying where it needs to be. When we know we're at home. Some of us can be home in the same circumstances we had before, but we are no longer the same person that was in those circumstances before. More often, the circumstances will change. Emma, who I love, talks about that if you want to change your position, whatever your position is, love where you are right now. That's a shift in normally for most of us, because most of us are not loving where we are right now when we're in a bondage situation. Love where you are right now, and one of two things will happen. Either the circumstances will change or you'll be lifted out of them. Okay? If you got a job you hate, love it. And either the people around you will change or you'll be lifted out of it. And I've done this several times. It works. So this week, your homework. 4 things this week. Are you ready? It's Holy Week. You can be extra holy. Number 1, notice where you feel in bondage. Notice. Where in my life am I feeling bound, limited, not being that full freedom of spirit? Where am I feeling in bondage? Just notice it. Don't beat yourself up for it. Just notice it. What have I outgrown that might have once worked well? What is it that no longer fits with me? Number 2, listen to the voice within. Listen to that burning bush. Listen to that Moses consciousness within, and let it guide me out of the old and starting into the new, and trust the journey. Trust that Spirit will lead me where it is that I need to go. If I'm listening to and following that authentic voice, it may look deserty for a while, but I will be loved, supported, and guided where I need to go. So number 2 is listen to the voice within. Number 3, be ruthless with your stinking thinking. Be ruthless with it. You don't need it anymore. There comes a point where you sit there and go, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life living like this. I was joking with Sue, and we were going over my lab results just before service, and it's like, there's a couple things in there that, David, if you continue down this path, you're not going to live very much longer, or at least not be feeling really good living very much longer, okay? And when you get a little, wake-up call like this, some of us have had wake-up calls in other ways, it's the kind of, well, I've been going along, it's been okay, and then all of a sudden the universe sends a 2x4, right? You've had this 2x4s, yes? Okay? It wakes us up, and we finally sit there and make the decision, do I want to take off in a new direction? Do I want to really do what I know all along I've been supposed to be doing? Or am I going to keep on going the way I am? So we be ruthless with our thinking, stinking. We stay away from the false gods that dissipate our energy. Then finally, number 4 is develop the consciousness to fully move into your good. Develop the consciousness of the promised land. When you know what your promised land is, and most of us do, or at least we have some idea of what it is, we at least know the feeling of what it feels like. Move into that feeling and live from there. And let nothing stand in the way of your direct experience. Part of clearing out the promised land is that's the stuff that's in the way of the direct experience of the promised land. My soul can't have the direct experience of the promised land while there's other stuff occupying it. And so that's why we ruthlessly clean out all the stuff that's in it. So we're going to be aware of where we're feeling bound. We're going to listen to the voice within. We're going to get ruthless with our stinking thinking. And we're going to develop the consciousness to fully move into our good. Are we good with that? Yeah. All right, that's your practice this week. I want to close with a quote from a great philosopher named Annie DeFranco, who's a singer. This is a lyric from one of her songs. They say that the truth will set you free, but then again, so will a lie. It depends if you're trying to get to the promised land or if you're trying to just get by. This week, I invite you to go for the promised land instead of just getting by, and to listen to that truth, that capital T truth within. Let's pray. And so I know that there is one infinite presence, one pure freedom, one pure love. Nothing limits that. Nothing is in the way of that. That is all that there is. That freedom is all that there is. And we are one of it. We already are the Moses consciousness. We already are the Joshua consciousness. We already are that hero self within us that knows how to do this journey and move into our promised land, our own unique expression of promised land. And so I speak my word that we release that which has held us back in the past. We let go of our smallness. We let go of our fear. We let go of everything that has held us back in the past. And we step ever more fully, ever more abundantly into that promised land, into that full expression of the freedom of the soul, the freedom of the authentic self of who we are. We say yes to that. We say yes to that full freedom. We trust the Spirit within us. We are willing to leave the safety of the bondage of Egypt, to make the traverse, to find where the places are blocked, the way is made open, to take as much time as we need to let the old patterns fall away, and to finally fully move into our promised land. We allow this Passover from one consciousness to the next to be the truth of our story, to be the truth of our souls. And so in great gratitude for the yes that we say and for the good that comes out of this, because when we move into our promised land, it blesses each and every person around. It creates a thriving all around us. And so in gratitude for that good that comes out of it, I release this word into a law that moves us into form and experience, knowing that it is the law that does the work. We trust it. We let it be. And together we say, and so it is. Thank you.